Hello again. So in this last video, I'd like to quickly talk through Johnson and Neal's results, and then think a little bit about how to interpret them in light of our theories. So this table here really shows their top line big picture result. And what they're going to find is that a large fraction of the black-white wage difference among men and women and the white-Hispanic wage difference among men and women can be explained by differences in AFQT scores. So if we look here, if we just look at black versus white men first, this first coefficient here is going to tell us that black men earn about 24% less than white men on average if we just control for age, right? Whereas Hispanic men earn about 11% less than white men on average. If we add controls for AFQT, so if we say, how do the earnings of black and Hispanic men compare to the earnings of white men with similar AFQT scores, we're going to find that black men earn about 7% less than white men with similar AFQT scores, and Hispanic men earn the same amount on average as white men with similar AFQT scores. If we do the same thing for women, we're going to come to similar conclusions, right? If we just look at average earnings between black women and white women and Hispanic women and white women, we'll find that black women earn about 18.5% less than white women on average. Hispanic women earn about 3% less than white women on average. Once we've controlled for AFQT, we're going to find that black women earn about 3.5% more than white women with similar AFQT scores. Hispanic women earn about 14.5% more than white women with similar AFQT scores. And of course, this column here really explains a lot of why the authors, why Derek Neal and William Johnson don't spend as much time with results on women, because this is very likely to be biased by your likelihood of being in the labor force, right? It's going to be very likely to be biased by a larger fraction of white women who are not working having higher potential earnings than the black and Hispanic women who are not working. So if we focus on men here, what should we take away from this table? Well, the first thing is, and this is kind of their main point, this control for AFQT score explains a lot more of the black-white wage difference and the white-Hispanic wage difference than do more traditional controls. Like if we controlled for years of education, right? If we controlled for years of education, it would explain half to a third of the wage difference, right? Controlling for AFQT explains about 2/3 of the wage difference between black and white men and 100% of the wage difference between white and Hispanic men. And so the conclusion that they draw from this is essentially that traditional controls, like highest grade completed, are going to be misleading if whites and non-whites have different average quality of education, right? If black and Hispanic students tend to go to high schools and elementary schools that provide lower quality education, you might have the same years of education but have learned fewer skills. Now, the second thing that they're going to do, right, is they're going to ask the question of whether black and Hispanic men are going to have, and black and Hispanic women are going to have the same return to increased skills as do white men and women. And we know why this, the reason that this is such an important thing to know is because of the Coate and Lowry model, right? If we think that black and Hispanic men or black and Hispanic women have fewer returns to acquiring skills than do white workers, that's going to suggest that even if we control for skills when you're 18 years old or 16 years old, we might still be capturing some aspects of labor market discrimination because young black and Hispanic people might look forward to a career where they're not going to be valued for their skills and thus learn that they shouldn't invest as much in their skills as they would otherwise. What they're going to find here is that in fact the returns to skill are very, very similar for black, white, and Hispanic workers, right? So these three columns here are essentially separating the sample into black, white, and Hispanic workers and doing a regression of earnings onto AFQT and AFQT squared. And what you can see, right, is the return to an extra point in the AFQT is actually a little bit higher for black workers than for white workers, and a little bit lower for Hispanic workers than for black or white workers. And this quadratic term is going to be higher for black-white workers than for white workers. So this is going to suggest that at least if we look at the black-white wage differences, black workers are not receiving lower returns for investing in their skills. If anything, they might be receiving slightly higher returns from acquiring higher skills. Whereas it's harder to say for black workers, for Hispanic workers, there is in fact some evidence that Hispanic men are getting a lower return on acquiring higher levels of skill than do white men. The other way that they do this is they put all, they do a regression on the full sample where they look at the difference in return for black workers and for non-black workers in increased AFQT scores. And again, they're going to find that, if anything, black workers get a slightly higher return for higher levels of AFQT than do white and Hispanic workers. If they look at women, they're going to come to a similar conclusion, although, as we've said, they're a little bit less confident in their results for women overall. But they're still going to find here that the change in earnings that comes from a change in AFQT is going to be pretty similar for white, black, and Hispanic women, with the difference being that this quadratic term is higher for white women than for black and Hispanic women, suggesting maybe that white women get a higher return for very high levels of the AFQT. Okay, the last thing I want to talk through in terms of big picture results is we talked about this attempt to adjust for different likelihoods of being in the labor force overall, right? We wanted to adjust for the fact that if black and Hispanic men are receiving lower earnings on average, conditional on skill, than white men, that's likely going to mean that the lowest earning black and Hispanic men drop out of the workforce at higher rates than the lowest earning white men do. And that's going to create negative bias, right? Well, that's going to actually increase our estimated average earnings of black and Hispanic men relative to white men. And it's going to lead us to underestimate the importance of discrimination. So as we talked about, the way the authors deal with this is they look at median earnings rather than average earnings and see how much of the difference in median earnings can be accounted for by the AFQT when you include all the people who aren't working as if they earned below median wages. And so what we're going to see is, overall, median earnings for black workers, once we account for this different likelihood of being in the workforce, are about 35% lower than median earnings for white workers. For Hispanic men, it's about 18% lower. If we account for the AFQT, right, if we control for the AFQT, we'll say that among white men with the same AFQT score, median earning, or among black men with the same AFQT score, median earnings are going to be 13% lower than for similar white men. For Hispanic men, median earnings are going to be, again, about the same as for similar white men. So what they're going to conclude from this is that indeed there is likely to be negative bias in the overall black-white wage difference and in the amount of the black-white wage difference that might be due to discrimination that can't be attributed to AFQT scores, but it's not going to be an enormous bias. At most, we might be thinking that the effect of discrimination on wages could be about a doubling in the black-white wage difference after accounting for the AFQT, right? From about a 7% difference to an almost 14% difference. Okay, so how should we understand these results? Well, the first thing to point out here is, even if we don't worry at all about unaccounted for racial bias in the AFQT as a measure of productivity, right? Even if we believe that they have perfectly captured the share of black-white wage inequality that comes as a result of different skills coming into the labor market versus the share of black-white wage inequality that comes about as a result of discrimination, their findings still suggest that discrimination plays a pretty substantial role in producing the black-white wage inequality that we see, right? If we take their results completely seriously, they suggest that black workers earn somewhere between 7 and 14% less than similar white workers, similarly productive white workers, for reasons that could be a result of labor market discrimination. So the way that they want to interpret these results, the argument that they make, is that while these results don't suggest that there isn't a role for labor market discrimination in producing black-white wage inequality, their results suggest that the differences in measurable skills between black and white youth before they enter the labor market are a larger component of black-white wage inequality. And because they see that black workers are rewarded similarly to white workers for higher levels of skill, they're going to argue that if we had policies that increase the skill levels of young black people, those policies would result in a convergence of black-white earnings. So this leads to a natural question of where are these differences in skill coming from? Why is it that black teenagers in their sample have such lower AFQT scores than white teenagers in their sample? So the first thing to say when we're thinking about this question is to point out that we do have, in fact, very substantial differences in average AFQT scores between black and white teens. So if we look at the scores of black versus white men, the way to interpret this is that this is going to show you scores relative to the average, so number of standard deviations, either above or below the average. You can see that for both black and white men, AFQT scores follow something kind of close to a normal distribution, but the black teens' AFQT scores are distributed much lower than the white teens' AFQT scores. And as a result of that, right, a very large fraction of youth who have very low scores, who are less than one standard deviation, who are lower than one standard deviation below the average AFQT score, are going to be black, and a very small fraction of youth who score more than one standard deviation above the average on the AFQT are going to be black. If we look at women, we're going to see a very similar pattern. Normally distributed scores for both black and white women. But again, we're going to see that black women are going to be very heavily overrepresented in the very lowest score categories and very heavily underrepresented in the very highest score categories because of the fact that there's a lower average overall. And again, I just want to make very, very clear here, this is going to be a measure of scholastic achievement. It's going to be something like an SAT. It's going to tell you how much you learned in high school. It is not a measure of any sort of innate ability. So what Neal and Johnson do next is they say, let's see if we can account for these differences in AFQT score using measures of family background and measures of school quality. So this first column here is going to tell you the raw difference in average score between black and Hispanic men compared to white men, right? So this is going to tell you that on average, black men score about one standard deviation below white men on the AFQT, and Hispanic men score about 0.7 standard deviations below white men on the AFQT. So these are very, very large differences in average scores. Once we add controls for family background, and then controls for family size, the availability of reading materials in the family, and then finally a series of controls for school quality, those differences in AFQT scores fall dramatically. As you can see, when we include the full set of controls, the difference between the score of black and white youth who have similar parent education, parent profession, and similar quality schools in this very small number of dimensions, that gap falls from 1 standard deviation to about 0.4 standard deviations, and the gap entirely disappears between Hispanic youth and white youth. So because of the fact that this is a fairly limited set of indicators of family resources and school quality, this suggests that if we address these gaps in resources available to black and white children and Hispanic and white children, that could very substantially close the gap between black and white AFQT scores and Hispanic and white AFQT scores. If we look at women, we're going to see a very, very similar pattern, right? The raw differences between black and white women's AFQT scores and Hispanic and white women's AFQT scores are respectively 1 standard deviation and almost 0.8 standard deviations. Once we account for all of these family background characteristics, those differences shrink to about 0.6 standard deviations for black women and 0.3 standard deviations for Hispanic women. So these observable characteristics of families are going to account for a very, very large share of these observed differences in scores. Okay, so I want to end today's discussion by putting these results in a little bit more context and adding a few additional caveats to what we've talked about. So the first thing to say is, a natural way to interpret these results is to say that if we can account for somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the black-white wage gap and the entirety of the white-Hispanic wage gap with a single indicator of pre-market skill, that might lead us to conclude that if we had a better set of indicators of pre-market skills, we could account for close to the entire wage gap, right? It might lead us to believe that discrimination really doesn't play much of a role in setting wages. And that might be the case, but as we've talked about, it's not necessarily true that a richer set of controls for pre-market abilities would lead to a smaller estimated effect of discrimination. And the reason for this, right, is that ultimately what's going to lead to our discrimination coefficient either being underestimated or overestimated by this strategy is whether the racial differences in AFQT scores are bigger or smaller than racial differences in other characteristics that affect labor market productivity. So it's not, it's not right to think that we've used this one set of skills to account for this large share of the gap. And so if we had more skills, we would necessarily account for more and more of the gap. We might in fact account for less and less of the gap in wages. A second thing to point out is that because of the fact that we have these very different distributions of AFQT scores among black and white youth, it's difficult to draw too many conclusions based on this research for either very, very high-skilled Black youth or for relatively low-skilled Black youth. And the reason for that is we really don't have many white youth to compare, right? So if we wanted to ask, for example, do Black workers face significant barriers from discrimination being hired into the very highest paid or highest skill professions in the economy? This research would really not give us much to go on because we simply don't have enough observations in this data of Black teenagers who have very, very high AFQT scores to tell whether they receive similar wages to white workers with very, very high AFQT scores. And likewise, it's difficult for us to know from this research whether the Black youth with very low AFQT scores are being treated similarly to white youth with similar AFQT scores because there aren't enough white youth to compare them to. So this lack of overlap means that it's difficult to draw too many conclusions on the extreme of the skill distribution. And of course, another thing to point out is, if we want to think about these very high-skilled jobs, right, the very top of the wage distribution, we also couldn't get very much by doing this. We couldn't get very much information about those sorts of jobs using a Bertrand and Mullainathan strategy, right, because you never get a job as a CEO by sending a resume blindly to an HR department. And if you ever got your resume screened for a job like that, people would notice that you were a fictitious person. So where this leaves us is with a little bit of despair, right? We've seen a couple of strategies now to try to estimate the effect of discrimination on wage differences between Black and white workers or white and Hispanic workers or men and women, any group that we care about. And essentially what we've concluded is it's going to be almost impossible to draw really strong conclusions by looking at real wage data from real people, because of the fact that it's virtually impossible, well, it is impossible to experimentally assign people to a race or a gender or a sexual orientation or any of these categories of discrimination that we care about. And so as a result, the best that we can do is to try to draw the conclusions we can from a series of highly imperfect sets of data and highly imperfect sets of evidence. Right? Whether they're imperfect for Bertrand and Mullainathan reasons of being difficult to extrapolate to the broader world, or whether they're imperfect for the same reasons as Neal and Johnson, because of the fact that we need to make very strong assumptions that might not hold. Okay, on that note, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I look forward to talking to you about this paper soon.